There's a Flannery O'Connor short story that I think about quite often. It's called Revelation. And in it, a woman named Mrs. Turpin is presented as being a pious, church-going woman, a woman who considers herself to be very religious and devoted. But Mrs. Turpin is also, though she doesn't know it, very self-righteous and judgmental. Well, there's a scene in which Mrs. Turpin is sitting in a doctor's waiting room, and in her head is quietly looking down on and is standing in derision of all of the other people in the waiting room with her. For you see, in Mrs. Turpin's opinion, these other people are all ill-mannered, uncivilized, trash, as she calls them to herself, almost subhuman. And the genius of Flannery O'Connor is that we as readers are able to see the stark contrast between Mrs. Turpin's actual words in the scene, words about how much she loves Jesus and about how much she cares about humanity. We are able to see the stark contrast between her actual words and her thoughts about the real live human beings who were stationed right around her. And then comes the remarkable moment in the story. As Mrs. Turpin is quietly feeling superior to these human beings about whom she claims to care so much, suddenly an unkempt, slovenly, crazy-eyed young girl hurls a book at her, hits her in the head, and then screams a word of judgment about her, about Mrs. Turpin. And all well and good, we as readers would think, tit for tat, so to speak. But the thing about it is, Mrs. Turpin hears these words as coming not from the girl, but as ultimately having come from God. And moreover, as the story then unfolds, Mrs. Turpin grows further and further convinced that this is indeed the case. That is, that these unwelcome words had indeed come to her from God Almighty, not from the girl who spoke them. Hence the story's title, Revelation. And I bring this story up this morning so as to remind us that revelation of the divine, contrary to popular imagination, is not always syrupy sweet, not always joyous and inspiring. In fact, sometimes revelation of the divine can be piercing and brutal. You know, one of the most remarkable things about human nature is that we have somehow been able to turn God into an object, into an idea, into a concept that we can discuss with one another and that we can theorize about. And I say that this is remarkable because if God really is God, then the very last thing that God is an object. Instead, if God is God, then God is the animating force behind and throughout all that is. The very ground of our being, the source of every single breath we take, and the one who has specific intentions for all that has been created. And so then for human beings, beings created by God, to be able to speak so lightly and casually about God, well, that's quite remarkable indeed that we can even do that. So having said that, I want us to pay close attention to something that Mark writes in today's gospel lesson, something that I think we lose sight of too easily, and something that, if we'll take closer notice, will restore unto us, I think, a wider range of appreciation for what it means to worship God and to be disciples of the living Christ Jesus. And so here is what that something is. I want us to look at how Mark describes the woman to whom this first miracle in today's passage happens. Which is to say, I want us to look momentarily past the miracle itself and look at the woman to whom it happens, to her response, to what happens to her. After Jesus heals the woman, this woman who has suffered for 12 years under this hemorrhaging, immediately after this happens, the woman comes to him, Mark writes, quote, in fear and trembling, and falls down prostrate before him. Do we get that? Rather than run around celebrating her newfound wholeness, rather than screaming out in joy, rather than posting about it on Instagram with #blessed. Instead, this woman immediately experiences fear and trembling. And this, I want us to note this morning, is what sometimes happens to us when we are reminded that God is not, in fact, an object that we talk about, but that God is, in fact, the very force we live each second of each day in light of. For you see, fear and trembling in a biblical sense is not general human worry or run-of-the-mill existential human anxiety. Instead, fear and trembling in a biblical sense describes what it is like to be seized by the great I am, by the one who spoke the world into being, and by the one who this very second sustains every single atom and fiber within it. Yes, fear and trembling in a biblical sense is what happens sometimes when we are addressed by the living God and when we know all at once from whom this address has come. And not so much because we are scared of this divine address. It's not about fear of, but instead it's because we are suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer power and majesty that it reveals. In other words, sometimes divine revelation reminds us of our smallness over against the vastness of the Creator of everything. Let me tell you a story. A recent revelation story of my own. About a year or so ago, I'd guess it was, April and I and the kids were all about to leave the house for a neighborhood walk when Juliana declared that she wanted to bring some trash bags and a pair of gloves with her so as to pick up litter on our walk. Well, April and I hemmed and hawed about this for a moment because we just wanted to go for a quick walk. We didn't want to make a whole thing about it. We didn't want to turn it into a community service day. But Juliana was adamant about this. So we relented and we let her bring along these items. And sure enough, as we walked, Juliana would stop and pick up trash and put it in her bag, and it went on like this for about 20 minutes or so. But then about halfway through our walk, as we made it to an undeveloped cul-de-sac in the back corner of our neighborhood, Juliana suddenly announced that she was going to wade into the woods where she'd seen a bunch of litter strewn about in the trees and in the bushes. Now, to be clear, by litter, we are talking here of things like old beer cans and styrofoam cups and fast food drive-through bags and other such detritus that often gathers in dark, undeveloped cul-de-sacs. And thus, I told Juliana that no, she was not going to go into the woods and pick up this trash. Told her that someone else had made this mess and that it was dirty and that it was unhygienic for her to be touching it. And then as she persisted in her plea, I told her that she was holding us all up by arguing about it and that we were going to continue on our walk. I was laying my foot down. But what about the animals that live there? She asked me, her voice on the verge of tears, not exaggerating. And by the way, to fully appreciate this story, you have to know how tender Juliana's heart is and how aware she is at all times of any possible suffering or sadness around her, human or otherwise. Always has been that way. The animals will be fine, I said, beginning to walk. No, they won't, she cried, her tears now legitimately beginning to fall. They won't be all right. How would you like it if someone threw trash all around your house? They will be fine, I said. And with that, I began to walk on. And beside me, April began to push the stroller. But then behind me, as she began obediently to follow, I heard her say, "You say you're a pastor, but you don't care at all about the environment." Now, it's hard to deliver this line quite the way that she did, because you have to understand, she really was not trying to spite me. It wasn't mean-spirited. It wasn't a cold accusation. It was more a statement of grief, almost like a biblical lament, like the words of an Old Testament prophet. And here's the thing. That sentence has come back to me over and over again in the ensuing months. Because you see, I am convinced it wasn't just from Juliana. The more I think about it, instead, I believe in my gut that those words were my book in the face. They were my revelation, as it were, like the one Mrs. Turpin received in the Flannery O'Connor short story. For you see, to hear those words spoken the way that they were was immediately to experience a distinct form of fear and trembling, because, you see, these words revealed the naked truth, which is that as a pastor, I say I care about things like the stewardship and the upkeep of creation. But then I go about my days as blissfully culpable in the ongoing human exploitation of it as anyone else in the entire world. And until Juliana said that to me, I had not even noted, or at least I had not fully reckoned with, this rank hypocrisy. And that, you see, is what divine revelation can also sometimes do to us. It can remind us of our smallness over against God's immensity, like the woman in the passage. And it can bring us face to face with our own rank hypocrisy. Mrs. Turpin said she loved humanity, believed it to be true of herself. But without even knowing it, she spent her days judging and feeling superior to all human beings around her, at least those who weren't exactly like her. Meanwhile, I talk a big game about things like creation care and environmental stewardship. But dear Lord, help the baby turtles choking on my family's plastic straws and prodigious daily waste. Some of us giggle slightly at that, but it really is a fearsome thing. That is, to believe that the God who spoke the very world into being has just aimed a message of correction right at us. Annie Dillard famously writes, "On the whole, I do not find Christians sufficiently sensible of conditions. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews. For the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return." End quote. Crash helmets and life preservers. We don't need such things for a mere idea, do we? But for the Creator of the universe, who may indeed reveal himself to us at any second and draw us out to some place we never expected to go, well, to anticipate such revelation as this ought to induce in us fear and trembling indeed. And so then, as we reflect on the one who healed the hemorrhaging woman in today's gospel lesson, and as we take notice of her reaction to that healing, let us remember that we are speaking here not of some slick magician or some first-century miracle man, but that we are speaking instead here of the human embodiment of the one who spoke the very world into being. And then in remembering this, let us therefore approach him not as just another object in this world, but let us approach him instead as the one in whose awesome presence we daily stand. For divine revelation like this still happens every day. And it just may happen to us this very hour, reminding us of our smallness over against his limitless power